Alright, so today we're going to take a dive into British literature. We're going to focus mainly on three important periods, and these three periods are important for differing reasons. Those three periods would be the Romantic period, the Victorian period, and the Modernist period. And I want to point out before I dive into this presentation that these periods, the dates in which they started and ended, have a variety of different dates that professors or scholars say. But there are going to be a few that I point out specifically, but this is just my perspective. It's not defined. So we're going to start out with the Romantics. So the Romantic era started pretty much from early 19th century to roughly the mid 19th century. This was an era of nature and of the appreciation of a rustic life, specifically the movement away from the cities. At this point in time, the cities were seen by the Romantics as a way that could create a divide from your ability to feel and appreciate nature and the ability that nature has on one's life. So, the rustic life, the person that would appreciate the rustic life, would pull apart from the city and live in an area that is undisturbed by the city and what it contains. There's also a great interest in the supernatural or godlike character and the role that this character has on the individual. An example of this would be the poetic genius of Blake's that is talked about often in literature, and we see a search for what this godlike character, what role does it play on the speaker of the poem or the characters in the stories. Some of the noteworthy writers of the time would be Coleridge, Wordsworth, Byron, Shelley, but there's others. There's Barbaud, and many other writers that are important to this era and that their writing fits into this era. Today we're going to focus on a Coleridge poem. This poem is called Frost at Midnight. And so this poem, it shows a great appreciation of nature, and it's honored throughout. It has a great interest in the common life that's undisturbed, and we see this in lines 54 and 55 that read, "But thou shalt wander like a breeze by lakes and sandy shores." Now we know after reading this poem that Coleridge is speaking of his son, to his son specifically, who is sleeping in their cottage that is undisturbed by the life of the city. And he's appreciating the fact that his son, at a young age, will be able to appreciate nature and live in nature, whereas the speaker was born into the city and now at a later point in life is able to appreciate nature. But the speaker's son will be able to appreciate it as early as can walk and appreciate nature. But it also shows with nature comes a greater ability to think and feel. And we see this by the image of the fire and how this fire, an element, has the ability to bring the speaker back to a time before his present. And then even further back than that. And he's able to reminisce on his times of his younger days in correlation to how his son's days will be. And we also see that the speaker's son will be raised in nature and not the city, and the speaker claims that his son will see and hear the lovely shapes and sounds intelligible of that eternal language. So in this, we just see a plethora of just appreciation of nature, and we also see power in nature that is presented. This element of the fire having the ability to bring the speaker back, but without that, he wouldn't be able to feel and remember in the way that the fire has. So, with all this appreciation of nature and of the common life, we're going to shift into a drastically different era, the Victorian era. So the Victorian era, I'm going to say it begins when the Reform Act in Britain was enacted, and I'm going to say that it ended roughly around when Victoria's death was. So, what sets the Victorian era apart from the other eras. Well, there was a great amount of variety in the subjects. Basically, anything that was relevant to the time, people would write on it. If it was relevant to anybody that would be reading, it was written upon. Gender becomes a great issue and a great theme to write about. Specifically, in the color plate, we see an image of the woman question. This woman is wearing an outfit that would be seen as promiscuous. You know, you wouldn't go out shopping in the outfit that she has on specifically. And, we see her looking at out the window, which shows that she's wondering more about than the places she's placed in. She's wondering what else is out there. Um, we also see beautiful sensory images in the poetry and in the stories that are written. Just we are painted these beautiful pictures within the poems. City and industry, and specifically social class, is just a huge role and a huge theme in the Victorian era. We're seeing in the specifically with industry, we see in the other color plate that's in the bottom right, we're seeing a color plate where men are laying a sewer in a city, and we're seeing life go on. We're seeing people selling things. We're seeing workers. We're seeing in the right side, we're seeing people who are thinking and analyzing what's going on. And then we have prominent people in the background on horses, and we're just painted this beautiful sensory image, but at the same time we're seeing industry. Um, some of the notable writers would be Tennyson, Dickens, Arnold, Browning, and actually we're going to be looking at a Victorian poem by Browning. This poem is going to be called "The Bishop Orders His Tomb at St. Praxed's Church." Now, this is far different than the romantic poem that we looked at beforehand. This specifically, we see a picture of Browning, by the way, but we're given a picture in this poem of St. Praxed's Church. And you can see in the other color plate right there, the picture, that St. Praxed's Church is a beautiful, beautiful church. But we're kind of shown these materialistic images throughout. Whenever one reads of a bishop, one does not think of material things. We think of, work for God in their life that they've gave to God, and kind of a lowly life. But we see through this that the bishops lived a very, very good life, but we also see a corrupt nature in this bishop. It questions the intentions of the bishop compared to what a bishop's intention should be for God. We see that the bishop, is more worried about his earthly tomb than what a bishop would see as an eternal life with God. We see he has tangible desires over supernatural and the afterlife. Relevant topic to the time. So religion was still popular. There was a lot of questions around religion on how important it is. And so this was very relevant. People would read this and they would maybe be able to, see a true event that was going on in maybe their church or another church. And one can definitely identify a sense of social class in this poem. One can see that the bishop has lived a life better than most, and he's going to get a very, very nice tomb. He's talking about these great stones that he wants his tombstone to be engraved with, and he's talking about the gym that he has. And so, there were people who were very, very poor at this time, and a bishop, a man of God, was living a higher social class than they were. So, in closing on the Victorian era and the bishop orders his tomb, we just see that this was a very relevant topic, and that the social class in it makes it a relevant topic to the Victorian era. So now we're going to move to the Modernists. So the Modernist era began roughly in the late 20th century. And these categories, three categories are lumped together. These three categories are the Edwardian, Georgian, and modern. And these three eras are usually lumped together into the modernist, but they were three different eras specifically. So on the modernist era, there's a really big experimentation with form and willing to take a risk with form to have a greater impact on the poem or on the story. So there's a major shift in view as well. With this shift of view, we have a the pre-modern view was ordered, meaningful, optimistic, stable, faith, morality, and values. And the modern view would be chaos, futile, pessimistic, unstable, loss of faith, collapse of morality and values, confused sense of identity and place in the world. So we were sort of seeing glimpses of this with the bishop's orders his tomb. We kind of see a glimpse of, just an unstable view of a bishop. But at the same time, moving into the modernist era, we see it in a whole new, light. We're going to see in the poem we're going to view for it, a huge pessimistic movement and, a loss of faith. But on this page, I want to point out that the portrait we see is of Virginia Woolf, whom we read a novel about in class. She wrote the novel Mrs. Dalloway. We also see the color plate that we saw on the title page. This is actually a color plate of a battleground in World War One, and we see, this movement of pessimism and chaos in this. We see death. We see that death and just the action of war has overtaken this once beautiful picture, place. And so moving on to the themes of modernism, there's a huge shift, and one of these the shift happened because of World War One. World War One had a major effect on the modernist writers, and this is the first time that the whole world was at war with each other. There was, mass chaos going on in the world. There was a wonder on whether going to war was the right idea or not. And with this, people started looking into the thought process that people had, interest in the mind and the thoughts of individuals. And we see that is a great theme in Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. And some of the other writers that are notable of this era would be Yeats, Eliot, but there's many others as well. Arnold is another. So the poem that we're going to view today is The Hospital Visitor by Alice Fane Trotter. So in reading this, one is introduced that the speaker is entering into the hospital where the speaker is bringing the people in the hospital, things, presents, and expecting the people in the hospital to just be depleted and just sad with their lives. But in turn, we see that they tell jokes and they're laughing, and in the end, we are told that the people, the speaker wants to believe that the soldiers in the hospital are doing this to mask the doubt and the pessimism and the sadness they have at being at war. But there's another view one can take and just say that these men who are in this hospital are just happy to be away from the chaos and the death of war. So the setting is a military hospital, as I said. It deals with the thoughts of character. This idea of stream of consciousness is in this poem. Deals mainly with the speaker's thoughts, but in the speaker's thoughts, we also see glimpses of the speaker is wondering what these soldiers are actually thinking. Not necessarily in the actions, but what their thoughts are behind these actions of telling jokes and laughing and just looking satisfied. Now, the speaker's tone in it is very pessimistic. The speaker's tone is the speaker goes in there, believing that these men in this hospital are broken men and they're injured and they're in a hospital. But we quickly see that this view can be skewed. Um, the loss of faith in narrator and possibly soldiers. So, as I've said earlier, we aren't quite sure what the soldiers are thinking. We are not given that as readers on what the actual thoughts of the soldiers were, but we are told that the soldiers are just happy to be away from war. We see, though, with the loss of faith of the narrator is evident that the speaker does not believe in the war. The speaker does not agree with this because the speaker in turn views these people in the hospital as broken people and in need of comfort and love. So in ending the modernist era, it's what distinctly sticks a piece of literature from the modernist era out opposed to a romantic or Victorian is the shift into wondering what place in life is, wondering, loss of identity in the world, wondering why what is happening, and looking back on one's life and questioning choices and decisions and what will happen in the future with those choices and decisions. In conclusion of this PowerPoint, once again, I want to point out there are many different dates that an era could have begun or ended. There's always variation in that, and also there's also a great variation in the literature and art that comes from each era. An example of a piece of literature that would be written in the Victorian era, but can be read as a modernist, is Hap by Arnold. It has every characteristic of a modernist poem, but was written in the time period of a Victorian era. Um, with this being said, most of the literature is fairly easy to identify on what era it would have came from. You wouldn't think that um, Frost at Midnight was a modernist poem by any means, and you wouldn't think that The Hospital Visitor was a Victorian, mainly because in the Victorian era, mechanized war was not going on, and we see that in The Hospital Visitor. But as I stated at the beginning, each of these eras were important for many different reasons to British literature and English literature to that as well. Um, each of these eras have a distinct portrayal of the literature of the time, and each of these eras are important to literature, for without the era happening, there could not be a movement to a new era. Without Romantics, there could be no Victorian. Without Victorian, there could be no modernism. And I hope you've enjoyed this PowerPoint, and I hope it was helpful to cover up any questions that you had in British literature, specifically with Romantic, Victorian, and Modernist eras. Thank you.